It was unspoilt and beautiful West Cork that saw the birth of a giant of Irish history, and although he died at the age of only 31, the shadow of Michael Collins still lies over the entire island. It lies heaviest, however, here in Cork, for it was in this southern county, among his own people, that he was shot dead after forcing the world's then mightiest empire to plead and bargain for peace. In this humble stone and mortar building near a meeting of roads called Sam's Cross, named after a Robin Hood-like highwayman, Sam Wallace, Michael first saw the light of day, or to be more precise, the light of a flickering candle, born in the early hours of October the 16th, 1890. His father, after whom he was named, a builder and carpenter as well as farmer of 90 acres, had married very late in life a 23-year-old fatherless girl, Mary Ann O'Brien, from just up the road. The great disparity in ages wasn't a hindrance to a happy marriage, and the home was filled with love and 8 children, 3 boys and 5 girls. Michael, the youngest, was born when his father was 75 years old. In later years, Michael would confess that he couldn't remember his father's face, but could vividly remember long and cherished chats together as they went to bring in the cows for milking. He was just 6½ when his father died as a result of a heart attack. On his deathbed, Michael Sr. told the assembled family, "Mind that child, he'll be a great man yet and will do great things for Ireland." Educated at nearby Lissaverde and then at the National School here in Clonakilty, 4 miles away, Michael was raised in an atmosphere of Irish nationalism. His teacher was an old member of the Irish Republican Brotherhood, which sought the independence of Ireland from Britain by armed force, if necessary. Michael, in later life, would become a member of this secret body. The other great influence on the young Michael was James Santry, the local blacksmith, whose father had forged pikes for rebellions in 1848 and 67. Here he listened, enraptured by tales of daring and sacrifice by the old Fenians, and perhaps dreaming of surpassing their exploits. But there were other activities for a young and boisterous boy. He spent many hours here on Black Strand near his home with schoolmates, bathing, although strangely Michael never learned to swim, fishing, and what became a lifetime pastime, grabbing a bit of ear. A rough and tumble bout of wrestling which would end only when one of the contestants was incapable of continuing. Michael, already showing sturdiness, usually won. Defeat infuriated him. 3 years after the death of her husband, Michael's mother, industrious and capable, had hired the labours of stonemasons and built a new house, Woodfield, alongside the old homestead. Today, only the gateposts remain and a vague outline on the bramble-strewn ground which held the pride of her life, her front flower garden. Her happiness was to be relatively short-lived. 4 years later, 15-year-old Michael crossed the Irish Sea. London, capital of an empire which included Ireland, beckoned. He passed the post office boy clerkship entrance examination and took up work here, the Post Office Savings Bank in West Kensington. His elder sister Hanny was already working in London for the civil service, so she became mother, sister and guardian to the young Michael. Their home was here, over a shop at number 5 Netherwood Road, West Kensington.
They got on very well. She was rather strict on him. I think she thought he was a bit on the boisterous side. Of course, he was only a young boy. And all the time he was in London, he was very much associated with the Irish games and all that type of thing, and was at the Irish clubs in London.
He was interested, very much interested in athletics. He was very fond of sport, but excepting for the one evidence that I could see, I have his medal too for 440 hours championship of the Gaelic League in London. He was very highly interested in the Gaelic League and in the London Irish Club.
He grew into a fine young man, 5 feet 11 inches tall and well built. Leaving the post office, he joined a stockbroking firm and then a bank as a clerk. World War I had begun. Thousands of Irishmen had joined the British Army, many of them believing their service would lead Britain to grant Ireland home rule. But much more importantly for the political and military history of his native country, Collins had joined the secret nationalist organisation, the Irish Republican Brotherhood, and its subsequent military wing, the Irish Volunteers. A visit home told him revolution was in the air, history was to be made, and he meant to be part of it. Early in 1916, the second year of the First World War, he told his English employers he was leaving to join an Irish regiment in Dublin. The assumption on their part was, naturally, a regiment of the British Army. In fact, he was meeting rebel leaders and helping to plan the long-awaited rising. Easter week 1916, and the rising found 25-year-old Captain Micheal Collins of the Irish Volunteers fighting in the General Post Office as aide-de-camp to Joseph Plunkett, one of the signatories of the Proclamation of Independence. As a military exercise, the venture was doomed before it had begun. After 6 days of fighting in various parts of the city, the leaders were forced to surrender. 16 of them were subsequently executed. 97 others were sentenced to death, but had their sentences commuted, including a young mathematics teacher, Eamon de Valera, who would figure greatly in the future political life of Micheal Collins. After the surrender, Collins was sent to Stafford Jail in England, and 2 months later, as prisoner number 74, to an internment camp at Frongoch in North Wales, along with 1,800 others. Collins dabbled in poetry, as well as teaching Irish history to fellow internees. During this time, Collins emerged as a natural boss. He was elected leader of Hut Number 10 and also earned the abiding nickname, the Big Fellow.
He was a very lively character as a young man. He was in on everything. He'd sing a song or he'd indulge in a game. He'd do anything. And I suppose there were two ways you could look on the big fellow idea. It wasn't because of his stature, though he was reasonably big, but he wasn't as big as many of his comrades indeed. But I think that his friends would say he's a big fella because he was an enormously able young man and showed great promise. But his enemies would say he was called a big fella because he used the Cork expression. He must have been a bit of a show-off, so you can take it any way you like.
Under international pressure, Britain released the internees on the 22nd of December 1916. Reviled by fellow citizens at the time of the Rising, they found the political climate changed, largely because of the execution of the leaders. The volunteers came home as heroes. Dublin city centre was still in ruins after the fierce fighting of Easter week. Many of the volunteers had fallen on hard times. Collins became paid secretary of the National Aid Association, which gave financial help and found them jobs. But it also gave him an opportunity to quietly begin reorganising the Irish Volunteers and to re-establish the Irish Republican Brotherhood. Within a year, he had become a member of the Supreme Council of the Brotherhood. Collins was determined that the wave of sympathy which had swept the country after the execution of the leaders of the Rising would not be allowed to die. He was equally determined that never again would the noble but useless sacrifice of set-piece warfare against superior odds be used. In the future, the volunteers would use the tactics of the Boers in Africa, hit-and-run guerrilla warfare. The influence of the old Irish Parliamentary Party, which had called for faith in the English government to grant home rule, was fast fading. Collins put all his efforts behind a successful opposition candidate in a by-election, Count Plunkett, father of an executed leader in the Rising. Among the others who gave support was Arthur Griffith, founder and leader of the old Sinn Féin organisation. Griffith, editor of a Republican newspaper, had been a great influence on the young Micheal Collins. Sinn Féin candidates, including Eamon de Valera in East Clare, were successful in 3 further by-elections. The military wing of Sinn Féin was the Irish Volunteers, who would later become the Irish Republican Army, better known as the IRA. De Valera was elected president of Sinn Féin. Cathal Brugha, a tough Dubliner and ardent Republican, became chief of staff. And Micheal Collins was appointed director of organisation. So what kind of young man was Collins?
The facts about Micheal Collins are all here. That's the file on Micheal Collins, the best that American money can buy. It's compiled by Arthur Schlesinger Jr., great historian, and maybe 16 historians. And every fact on Micheal Collins is in here. Every interview, every person he ever spoke to, every document, diaries, bits of paper he left around, they're all here. All the facts. And these facts tell you that he was brave, handsome, charming, ruthless, courageous, charismatic, and great leader. And they also tell you that he was cruel, calculating, devious, two-timed a lot of women, and was probably hypocritical in the sense that he went to communion a lot while carrying on an affair with 2 women at the same time. So they're the facts about Micheal Collins, and they don't amount to the truth about him. That's the problem.
In 1918, Sinn Féin, including Micheal Collins in South Cork, had an overwhelming victory in the general election. The party refused to attend Westminster Parliament and instead set up an Irish Parliament in Dublin, known as Dáil Éireann, proclaiming a republic. De Valera was elected president, Arthur Griffith vice president and Minister for Home Affairs, Cathal Brugha Minister for Defence, and Micheal Collins Minister for Finance. In addition, Collins became Adjutant General of the Irish Volunteers and, most importantly of all, Director of Intelligence. But by now there had been another great development in the life of Micheal Collins. During a visit to Granard in County Longford for a by-election campaign in May 1917, he had stayed here at the Greville Arms Hotel and fallen helplessly in love with the attractive daughter of the family. Catherine Bridget Kiernan, known to all as Kitty, was the second eldest of 5 children who had lost their parents when Kitty was just 16 years of age. Kitty had always been more mature than many of her contemporaries. She and her elder sister successfully took over the family enterprises, which included a sizable section of the town's commerce. Not only the hotel, but a bar, grocery, hardware and timber store, a bakery and an undertaking business. Kitty had great personality and was in much demand by the eligible bachelors of the town and county. As a consequence, she had a busy social life, holding parties in the drawing room of the hotel, attending dances in Granard and other parts of Longford, and travelling to Dublin for some of the top society functions. But Collins had a rival for the lovely Kitty. Harry Boland, fellow member of the Supreme Council of the IRB, and who, like Collins, would be elected in the general election of 1918. In fact, Boland and Kitty were sweethearts when Collins arrived in the Granard area, and it would be some years before Kitty would switch her affections. In April 1918, Collins was arrested near Granard for making a speech likely to cause disaffection. He was charged at Longford Town and given bail. He didn't appear at the next assize and went on the run. From then until the truce 3 years later, he was a wanted man. He set up operational offices in various parts of Dublin and a network of safe houses, the homes of sympathisers who would give him food and a bed for the night. Hotels and public houses around the city also served as meeting places for the volunteers. Collins travelled openly around Dublin, riding a bicycle from one meeting place to the next. At this stage, Dublin Castle didn't have photographs of him and relied only on poor descriptions of this most wanted man. He joked and chatted with troops and detectives at frequent checkpoints. One soldier, amused by Collins's chatter, was to say to him, "Well, you're a decent sort anyway." At the first meeting of the Dáil in the Mansion House in January 1919, Michael Collins and Harry Boland were marked present. They were, in fact, in England, helping Eamon de Valera to escape from Lincoln Jail, where he and another man were being held for allegedly organising another 1916-type resurrection in Ireland. Back home again, as leader of the illegal Irish Parliament, Dáil Éireann, de Valera called for the raising of a public loan to support the work of the Dáil. To Michael Collins, as Minister for Finance, fell the task of launching this. He used symbolically the block on which the patriot Robert Emmet had been beheaded a century before. Relatives of those executed in 1916 were the first to buy loan bonds, queuing for this propaganda film, which would be shown in towns throughout the country. When the loan closed, £379,000 had been raised. Gold and money collected by Collins was hidden in a house on the south side of the city and smuggled out in a child's coffin. The empty coffin was discovered in a bank a few years ago. The Dáil now took on civil administration duties in defiance of Dublin Castle, including courts of law. Thousands of military reinforcements were poured in from England. Inevitably, the shooting started. The authorities now intensified their efforts to smash the Republican movement through the police force's political unit, G Division. But unknown to even most of his own people, Collins already had spies in Dublin Castle and in G Division itself. One of those was Dave Nelligan, whose first meeting with Collins was in the upstairs room of a Dublin pub.
So the publican came out and opened the private door, and I was brought upstairs to one of the rooms where there smelled of stale beer. There was a middle-aged man sitting there, an old dust coat thrown over a chair. This was the famous Michael Collins. So Joe Riley introduced me. And Collins said to me, "It's too bad about your brother getting killed." My brother was killed down in Limerick in a motorcycle accident at Goulburn Bridge. He said, "We know he was all right. We know you're all right too. I want you to go back to work for me." So I said to him, "Mr. Collins, I'd rather do anything than go back to that bloody place again. I'll join a column if necessary. I'll do anything you want me to do, but I'd rather go back to that rotten giant Dublin Castle." Listen, Dave, says he, "We have plenty of people for columns. The British trust you and we trust you. If you want to serve the cause, go back." I had no answer to that. I said I would.
Another Collins spy in the castle was, incredibly, his own cousin Nancy, who had been transferred from the post office in London to Dublin.
Sometime in late 1918, early 1919, she was called into interview by the Honourable Sir James McMahon, who was the second most senior officer in the Department of Posts and Telegraphs in Dublin. His conversation went with her something like this: "Miss O'Brien, you will understand that in this attempt to undermine the British Empire, Collins has had men who have been able to bring him information with regard to the military administration of this country. In very many instances, Collins had this information before the officers for whom it was intended got it. And Whitehall are disturbed that civil administration could also present problems if Collins got to learn of certain happenings. We've studied your career in the post office, both in London and in Dublin. And in researching it, we've found that you have no interest in these upstarts who would tilt at the might of the British Empire. You're quick at your work, And on my recommendation, it has been decided to ask you to decode the messages, certain important ones that will come from Whitehall. My mother was astounded at this, and when work was over, she immediately made contact with Michael. His first remark to her was, "Well, Christ," he said, I don't know how they've held their empire for so long and achieved so much. You must hand it to them. But what a bloody intelligence service they have, that they would ask you, my second cousin, to be the repository of their confidences."
In May 1919, another unit of Collins's secret army was to be formed, the Squad, a group which would carry out attacks and raids. But within the Squad was an elite corps, 12 young men, all volunteers, nicknamed the 12 Apostles. These were full-time assassins, posing as tradesmen, but ready to pounce whenever Collins called upon them. One of those was Vinnie Byrne.
When you joined the Squad, you weren't just going to join and fall in behind the fella and say, "I'm a member of the Squad." You had to set yourself, the man in charge, to say, "This is your job now, get him." And they'd be all round far away, and maybe one man would be with you, and there's walking, coming along, and when you get him cleared of the traffic, let him have it, then run like hell.
Collins ordered attacks on village police barracks, forcing the survivors to permanently abandon the buildings. The eyes and ears of the authorities in the rural areas were now gone. One of the British officers involved in the attempted roundup of IRA men was a fellow Irishman, Bernard Law Montgomery, Monty, who would win fame at El Alamein in the Second World War. He's photographed here, interrogating IRA suspects in County Cork. In June of 1920, Eamon de Valera began an 18-month tour of the United States to rally American support for an independent Ireland. He raised $6 million for Doyle Erin, but he ran foul of Irish-American organizations and also failed to get the necessary political support of both the Republican and Democratic parties. Michael Collins, during this period, despite the demands on his time and the dangers of moving anywhere outside Dublin, travelled regularly to this house in Greystones in County Wicklow to bring housekeeping money to De Valera's wife to support her young family.
Collins risked his life once a week to go out to Greystones to bring out money to the De Valera's when Dev was in the States to see Mrs. De Valera and the children, and to make sure that they were all right and to play with the kids. I mean, the late Vivian De Valera, who took a great interest in the period and studied it as well as lived through it, used to tell me that, and you recall how Collins, when he'd be there, would play with them, and he referred to me as Uncle Mick, and he'd be sent up to the corner to keep an eye out for the black and tans to see whether they'd be coming, because an idea that an alert 12 or 13-year-old is a great scout. This is the sort of thing that the IRA had in those days. Boys, girls, eyes and ears everywhere. And from everything that one gathers from the period, he seems to have had a tremendous regard for Mrs. De Valera and her family, and for De Valera himself. I mean, he'd helped to get him out personally, went over to get him out of jail in England, personally arranged to get him into the States, and personally arranged to smuggle Mrs. De Valera afterwards to the States to see him. So I think there's no doubt that Collins had the warmest regard for him and the De Valera family for him. I think De Valera would have had a great personal relationship with him himself, and as far as politics would have allowed him, or as he saw politics allowed him, or as his vision of the thing would have allowed him, he would have tried to be warm to Michael Collins as well. Unfortunately, politics in the end got the upper hand.
By early 1920, police reinforcements were urgently needed. No previous police experience necessary. Hundreds of ex-soldiers, home from the Great War to a jobless Britain, were glad to accept the offer. They were not, as the IRA claimed, a bunch of criminals and psychotics recruited from jails, but some were criminals, and many black and tans frequently behaved as such. To the British government and those loyal to Dublin Castle, the behaviour of the IRA was no better. At short notice, it wasn't possible to provide the new recruits with complete uniforms. They wore black trousers and khaki tunics, or vice versa, and were quickly nicknamed the Black and Tans after a well-known hunt in Limerick. They ranged unbridled to fight terror with terror, but frustrated by the hit-and-run tactics of the IRA, they committed atrocities on the civilian population which were denounced even by newspapers and periodicals in Britain. As the IRA campaign intensified, the Black and Tans were joined by another group from Britain, the Police Auxiliary Cadets. These ex-army officers also operated a scorched earth policy, burning towns and villages. But the Auxies, many of them decorated for gallantry in the recent World War, also brought a grudging respect from the IRA for their bravery in battle. Many times they fought to the last man, refusing to surrender. But another and far more deadly foe now faced Micheal Collins. The year 1920 and the fighting intensified in the countryside, with flying columns of the IRA attacking military convoys and barracks, and the Black and Tans auxiliaries and army combing towns and villages for volunteers and their sympathisers. The IRA began burning the homes of property owners in retaliation for the destruction of houses by the military. Hostages were taken, and if IRA prisoners were executed, then the hostages suffered the same fate. In the midst of this tit-for-tat killing, there were incidents of chivalry. One British officer bequeathed his watch to the man who was about to execute him because the executioner, he said, was merely doing his duty. But amidst the turmoil and bloodshed, 2 deaths focused international attention on Ireland's troubles and brought further pressure on Britain. On the night of March the 19th, 1920, a party of armed men with blackened faces arrived at this shop and shot dead the Lord Mayor of Cork, Thomas McCurtain, who was also commandant of the Mid-Cork Brigade of the IRA. The killers were known to be members of the Royal Irish Constabulary, led by a district inspector. Collins had him killed later that year. At the inquest on McCurtain, the jury brought in a verdict of murder against the British Prime Minister Lloyd George, the Viceroy of Ireland, and the Inspector General of the RIC. In October of that same year, the body of McCurtain's successor, Terence MacSweeney, was taken from Brixton Prison in England, where he died after a 75-day hunger strike. Thousands of Londoners watched the procession as it made its way to the ship waiting to take the body home to Cork. MacSweeney, member of the Dáil and commandant of the 1st Cork Brigade of the IRA, had been charged with being in possession of a police cipher and of 2 documents likely to cause disaffection to His Majesty. Sentenced to 2 years' imprisonment, he went on hunger strike immediately. Before his arrest, he'd said, "It's not those who can inflict the most, but those who can endure the most, who will conquer." As the Lord Mayor had starved to death, countries around the world had called for his release. But Lloyd George said, if MacSweeney was released, then every hunger striker, whatever his offence, would have to be let off. That same year of 1920 brought heartache to Micheal Collins and his family. A detachment of the Essex Regiment arrived at the family home, Woodfield, late one night.
They rounded up some local people, the immediate neighbours of ours, and got them to pile in straw and other material in which they threw petrol. And at bayonet point they made the locals ignite the straw and stuff. And technically they made the neighbours burn the house down.
The family moved back into the old home alongside, which had been serving as a cattle shed and which the soldiers had tried unsuccessfully to burn. Today, smoke marks on the interior walls of the old home are reminders of that night. Later, standing in the ruins, Collins said, "They knew how to hurt me most." The officer in charge of the raid that night was Major Arthur Ernest Percival. 22 years later, as Lieutenant General Percival, he surrendered 60,000 of his troops to the Japanese in Singapore. But it was later in 1920 that a new and far more deadly adversary faced Michael Collins. Colonel Sir Ormond Winter came from London to reorganise military and police intelligence and to reopen communication with spies and informers, lines broken by the IRA campaign and Collins's squad. Colonel Winter, nicknamed the Holy Terror, had gathered a group of undercover men, quickly called the Cairo Gang because of their Dublin haunt, the Cairo Restaurant. Men like these in this photograph, used later by Collins to identify them. Through paid informers, various IRA hideouts were made known and raided. On a number of occasions, Collins, now with a reward of £10,000 on his head, narrowly escaped. And the noose was tightening, a fact brought home in October when the Vice Brigadier of the IRA's Tipperary Brigade, Sean Tracy, was shot down in the centre of Dublin by plainclothes army officers under orders from Colonel Winter. Drastic action would have to be taken by Collins, and soon. Through his own spies, he learned the names and addresses of these military men, most of whom lived incognito in houses well removed from Dublin Castle and army barracks. On the eve of what was to be the decisive day in Collins's campaign, one of his spies, Dave Nelligan, met two members of the big fellow's intelligence staff.
Bill Tobin and Tom Cullen invited myself and McNamara to the Gaiety Theatre. They had a box there. They were doing instead. And Bill Tobin produced a list of all the Secret Servicemen who were to be shot the next morning. And I said to him, look into the box next door there. They told him that already. Two of the men who were going to be croaked were in the box with women. So there was a man named Fitzgerald, or Fitzmaurice, I've forgotten which. I met him in the castle. He had only one arm. I met him in the castle that day, Saturday. And then my job was poking around to see who these fellas were. So I was talking to 3 or 4 more fellas that I got talking with. I knew some of them, Englishmen. So I said to your man who was an Irishman, what are you doing here? Oh, it's the same in the run from the IRA up from Clare. Where are you staying now? I said, I'm staying at 28 of Pembroke Street. I knew that place was a haunt of Secret Servicemen. He was shot.
9 o'clock on Sunday, the 21st of November, Vinnie Byrne and his fellow 12 apostles, augmented by other members of Collins's squad and formed into 8 groups, knocked on hall doors in various parts of the city. Altogether, 14 British officers were shot dead that morning. According to one account, some of the rooms afterwards resembled badly conducted abattoirs. For the first time since that morning, almost 70 years before, Vinnie Byrne, the last surviving member of the 12 Apostles, came with me to the house where he had executed 2 of those officers. The building now houses an insurance company. He and the other members of his group had attended Mass together in Westland Road Church and then walked less than a mile to number 38 Upper Mount Street. At exactly 9 o'clock, he knocked on the hall door. The maid opened the door. Vinnie Byrne said he had an important message for one of the officers. The maid knew something was amiss and tried to shut the door, but they pushed past her and demanded to know where the officers were sleeping. She indicated the front room and a room at the back of the house. When one section rushed into the front room through the adjoining one, the officer in the bed, which stood before this fireplace, reached under his pillow for a revolver, but quickly changed his mind. They bundled him down to the room of his colleague, a room which would now be the death chamber. Both men were made to stand on the bed up against the wall.
You 2 men have been sentenced to death, and I'm come here to carry out that sentence. The Lord have mercy on your soul. Then the shooting took place. Now we got out of the house as quick as we could.
What effect did the shootings have on Dublin Castle?
Panic. Utter panic. All the crowd who were living out all around the city all built into the castle. Rome couldn't be got to have a lot of money, and one of the Secret Servicemen committed suicide. complete panic. They arrested thousands of people. Hadn't a clue what they'd done. It was the biggest blow they ever got.
Although the dead officers were given a state funeral in London, British Prime Minister Lloyd George had secretly little sympathy for them. They got what they deserved, he said, beaten by counter-jumpers. Michael Collins wrote,
"For myself, my conscience is clear. There's no crime in detecting and destroying in wartime the spy and the informer. I have destroyed without trial. I have paid them back in their own coin."
But the killing wasn't over on that day, which was to become known as Bloody Sunday. At 3:15 that afternoon, Black and Tans went to Croke Park Stadium, where a football match was in progress between Dublin and Tipperary. They opened fire with a machine gun and rifles. 11 spectators and one of the players, Michael Hogan of Tipperary, were killed. 70 other people were either wounded by the gunfire or injured in the stampede for safety. As anxious relatives visited the injured, the arguments began. The Black and Tans claimed an IRA picket had opened fire on them as they arrived at the ground to search for those involved in the shootings that morning. People at the match denied this. The only IRA deaths that day were Dick McKee and Pater Clancy, captured the night before. In Dublin Castle, they were tortured and then killed. The fighting continued throughout the country. Part of Cork City was burned by the RIC and auxiliaries in retaliation for IRA ambushes. The IRA carried out more ambushes, and so the spiral of violence continued. Between January and July 1921, 228 police and 96 soldiers were killed. In 2 of those months, 317 IRA men and civilians died. Lloyd George was now under great pressure from at home and abroad to initiate a settlement. The biggest single operation by the IRA in terms of their numbers was the burning of the Custom House in Dublin, suggested by Eamon de Valera and approved by Michael Collins. On May the 25th, 1921, 120 volunteers, including some of Collins's squad, took over and burned the Custom House, which housed the local government board and the headquarters of the Inland Revenue. However, this gigantic attempt to cripple British administration was costly to the IRA. 6 of them were killed and 80 captured by auxiliaries who arrived at the scene. But it was one of the actions which led the British government, through King George V, to open the door to a truce. On a visit to Belfast on the 22nd of June, the King said,
"I speak from a full heart when I pray that my coming to Ireland today may prove to be the first step towards the end of strife amongst her people, whatever their race or creed. In that hope, I appeal to all Irishmen to pause, to stretch out the hand of forbearance and conciliation, to forgive and forget, and to join in making for the land they love a new era of peace, contentment, and goodwill."
A month later, after a series of communications, directly and indirectly, between Lloyd George and Eamon de Valera, a truce was agreed and came into effect at 12 noon on July the 11th, 1921. 3 days later, de Valera, Arthur Griffith and other delegates travelled to London. They were met at Euston Station by a jubilant crowd of followers and well-wishers and escorted to the Prime Minister's residence in Downing Street to discuss a settlement. On the road outside, women knelt and prayed for a lasting peace. Despite the promises the detailed talks offered, it was obvious when de Valera left London for Dublin some days later that he was an unhappy man. Although he returned as a conquering hero, he knew the partitioning of Ireland had already been agreed between Lloyd George and the Unionists in the north of Ireland. And to add to this, what was being offered to the remainder of the country was not even full Dominion status. With the ever-present threat of a resumption of the war between the IRA and Britain, the correspondence flowed between Dublin and London. The people waited for a decision. De Valera was re-elected president, and still the people waited. At last, Lloyd George presented a formula acceptable to both sides for treaty discussions. how the association of Ireland with the community of nations known as the British Empire may be best reconciled with Irish national aspirations. Michael Collins, meanwhile, was fighting and winning another battle for the love of Kitty Kiernan. As often as possible, he would travel to Granard in County Longford. Despite the frequent meetings, Kitty's other suitor, Harry Boland, was unaware that his great friend, Michael Collins, was determined to win the heart of his loved one. In the beautiful woods outside the town, Collins and Kitty walked alone and in the comparative safety of the truce agreed the previous month. After each meeting, and despite the demands on his time, Collins sent an almost constant stream of letters.
My dear Kitty, when I was speaking to you, I had a kind of idea that the horse show was coming off this week. But of course it's next week, and that's a very long time to wait to see you. When do you come up yourself? I mean, what day and what time? I'm really anxious to see you.
But Collins knew Kitty suffered pangs of guilt about the unsuspecting Harry Boland.
My dear Kit, many thanks for your nice note. Harry's back here this morning. Will that entice you to come to town to give you that chance to which he's entitled? Yours with love.
Kitty was not easily won. She had a fiery spirit and strength of character irresistible to Collins. Kitty visited Collins in Dublin, staying sometimes in a city centre hotel, but more often in the neighbouring county Wicklow. Here at the Grand Hotel in Greystones, the lovers found a haven from the pressures of political and military affairs. How their relationship survived at all during those times is difficult to imagine. As the treaty negotiations approached, the strain showed on Collins.
My very own dear Kit, I'm working almost asleep. You'll forgive scribble, therefore. Can't write any more. I'm thinking of you and in a nice way. Yours, I hope.
It was assumed that Eamon de Valera, a skillful negotiator, would head the five-man Irish delegation to London, but he argued that at a time of crisis, the head of state should remain at home. Arthur Griffith would lead the team, which included Michael Collins. This angered Collins, who argued that he was a soldier, not a diplomat, but de Valera was insistent. Was he setting up Collins?
Set up is a rather pejorative term, but it is true that de Valera himself, in his career, kept his hand on everything. When he was negotiating subsequently with the British, he did it personally. When he was drafting the Constitution, he did it personally. He was a meticulous man. He gave the impression that a lot of these people flying around were doing things with their own bat, but in fact he kept the tightest possible control on his cabinet and everybody around him. And he must have known from his dealings with Lloyd George beforehand exactly what was there. He also knew from his tours of America, remember he had international experience which the others didn't have, what the weight of world opinion was, what the traffic would bear. And he knew what the strength of British influence was in America and how the Irish-American lobby could be countered. And though he had raised a lot of money, 4 million or something for the war loan, what was it compared to the scale of the money England had poured into Flanders mud, for instance? So he knew better than most people what they were up against. And the fact that for once he didn't keep his hand on everything that was happening from a day-to-day basis and wasn't the man in the gap indicates that he knew that the gap was going to be very uncomfortable. It was a barn and whale, and he wanted to stay out of it.
In London, most of the Irish delegation party, including secretaries and staff, stayed here at 22 Hans Place. Collins, guarded by members of his squad, including Tom Cullen and Liam Tobin, made his headquarters at number 15 Cadogan Gardens in Kensington. Also with Collins was Emmett Dalton, who had fought with distinction in the First World War, but since then had been a member of Collins' military staff. Dalton, like Collins, was apprehensive about the London visit.
Well, we were annoyed at the idea of Collins going at all. I'm talking now of the army, because it exposed him, as you know, to the enemy, and he had been sheltered up to then. And we were he himself was very reluctant to come, as you know, and this caused us a lot of worry. So it was decided by the General Staff that we would purchase an aircraft I thought this idea up because I knew 2 air flying officers who would cooperate with us and who were now in the volunteers. And this was Jack McSweeney and Charlie Russell. So they came over ostensibly from the Canadian government, the forestry department, to purchase an aircraft for watching fires in forestry in Canada. And they succeeded in purchasing an aircraft, which we held at Croydon all the time. And this, the object, of course, being to, in the event of a breakdown, to get Collins back to Dublin as fast as possible.
Formal talks got underway at number 10 Downing Street on the 11th of October 1921. At 11 o'clock, Collins and his group entered the building. They were met at the door of the cabinet room by David Lloyd George, who sat down with his team in front of the fireplace. Arthur Griffith sat directly opposite him across the boat-shaped table, Micheal Collins beside him. Negotiations would last 2 months and entail 7 plenary sessions, 24 sub-conferences and 9 meetings of special committees. Each morning Collins went to Mass at Brompton Oratory and lit a candle for Kitty Kiernan. Often he'd return to Cadogan Gardens before his fellow delegates had wakened for the day ahead.
Kit dear, I've just returned from Brompton Oratory, lit a candle for you. I did a journey of 5 miles to my sister's place for a letter from you. No letter. Honestly, I felt it terribly, but I do not believe that you failed to write and won't believe it until I know. Goodbye for the day. Tough work before me. Every good wish and thought.
My very dear Micheal, I wonder how you were doing in London. Meet any nice girls that you liked? Did you kiss anybody since? I didn't get the chance. You know I'm only joking. My love to you.
In their correspondence, there were suggestions, too, of intimacy, experienced or perhaps tempted.
I love to have you here, but we must be really good. No bedroom scenes, etc., etc., etc. Taken too?
There was speculation also, privately and publicly, about Collins's relationship with one of his most ardent admirers, Lady Hazel Lavery, wife of the renowned artist Sir John Lavery. Lady Lavery, who would one day grace the Irish pound note, was one of London society's great beauties. Collins frequently visited her home.
Well, there's hardly a diarist in London that ever wrote that didn't refer to their relationship. Lady Diana Cooper talks about it. George Bernard Shaw referred to it. But at home specifically, the person most close to Hazel Lavery was Anita Leslie, her companion, daughter of Sir Shane Leslie. Anita Leslie was her companion all her life until she died an old woman. And she told her everything. And she told her of her affair with Micheal Collins, chapter and verse.
But Anita Leslie's father, Sir Shane Leslie, cousin of Winston Churchill, had a different explanation for those frequent visits to the Lavery home here in London.
In the Lavery studio, we brought in Winston instead of a government building. And they all were pretending to be painted pictures. But it would have been quite impossible to get any kind of a treaty if it had not been for Winston and Collins and Lady Lavery.
We put together the fact that he spent 2 months negotiating a treaty in London, and that probably every second night he dined at Lavery's house, given he was 30 years of age and she was 34, given that his diaries continually mentioned day with Hazel Lavery, day with Hazel Lavery, met Hazel Lavery, given that Sir John Lavery was 68 years of age, and that everyone in London believed he connived at the relationship, given the sexual morals of London society at the time, given the fact that Collins was a virile young man, given the fact that she was frantically in love with him, given the fact that every London diarist and hostess put them together at the dinner table, and given above all the hatred she excited in Dublin upper class society when she came home, I'm certain that she had an affair with Micheal Collins.
But that certainty of an affair is not shared by members of Kitty's family.
I don't hold any faith in it. I think if anyone who reads the letters in the book, in the collection, from both Collins and Kitty and the Laverys themselves, would find it very hard to see any truth in it. I certainly wouldn't like to think there was. Or I don't, rather not that I wouldn't like, but I don't think there was any.
Collins himself wrote to Kitty about newspaper reports at the time.
You ought to have seen some of the papers here yesterday. M. Collins in Downing Street with his sweetheart. The Laverys took me there in their car. Some of the correspondents recognised my friend, but the story was too good.
Back home, Eamon de Valera hoped for a peaceful outcome of the talks with the British, but as a precaution against a resumption of hostilities, toured Ireland to inspect the volunteers and encourage recruiting. The British would not agree to an Irish republic. They would, however, offer Dominion status. Most difficult of all for the nationalists, they would have to swear an oath of allegiance to the English king. De Valera would agree to external association with the Crown, internal association involving allegiance, no. In Downing Street, Lloyd George threatened the Irish with immediate and terrible war if they rejected the terms. On the 5th of December, the British gave the Irish a deadline of 10 o'clock that night to accept or reject. The deadline came and passed. At 11:15, the Irish returned to Downing Street. They would sign. Some details were cleared up, and then, just after 2 o'clock in the morning, the two sides put their signatures to the treaty. Later that day, Lloyd George and his negotiating team went to Buckingham Palace to receive the congratulations of their jubilant king on the successful conclusion of the treaty talks. In another part of the city, however, Micheal Collins was deeply troubled. Earlier that morning, in his room in Cadogan Gardens, he had paced the floor for some time and then sat to write to Kitty Kiernan.
I don't know how things will go now, but with God's help, we have brought peace to this land of ours, a peace which will end this old strife of ours forever.
This guarded optimism was reserved only for Kitty. To a friend, he wrote what was a chilling prophecy.
Think, what have I got for Ireland? Something she has wanted these past 700 years. Will anyone be satisfied at the bargain? Will anyone? I tell you this, I sign my death warrant.
The new year of 1922 saw growing division in Ireland about the wisdom of signing the treaty. Meetings and rallies were held up and down the country. Those in favour of the agreement argued that it was the best deal possible. Those against claimed the Irish delegation had sold out. Guns were always at the ready at these rallies and would sometimes be used.
He knew to a round of ammunition what they had. He knew he had a divided cabinet. He wasn't bereft of sources either. He still had the IRB network, and he was being reported to. He said, as he signed it, he was signing his own death warrant. He knew the bitterness of the Irish and the way they turn on their own leaders and that sort of thing. History has proved that from the time that Micheal Collins signed the treaty to this year, it has not been possible for nationalist opinion, be it of the provisional IRA kind or of the constitutional kind, to advance the Irish position any further than he took it.
We see that Collins signs a treaty, earns antipathy of Mr. de Valera, but the fact is that through most of that year of 1921, and for the years before that, he was not the person in the cabinet at the time that was in favor of a truce or two negotiations. That he was very much for continuing as far as they could go in military effort. He organized, was certainly responsible for being a key leader of the ambush effort and the counter-reprisals for what he saw was a matter of meeting British terrorism from the standpoint of what he saw General Macready doing in the Black and Tans, then he responded in kind. But the fact is that by June of 1921, it was his position, with that of Mulcahy, that they had gained as much as they could at that point militarily.
On the agreement, Eamon de Valera said,
I am against this treaty because it does not reconcile Irish national aspirations with association with the British government. I am against this treaty, not because I am a man of war, but a man of peace. I am against this treaty because it will not end the centuries of conflict between the two nations of Great Britain and Ireland. If the treaty is ratified, the volunteers of the future will have to resort to civil strife to complete the work of the past 5 years.
In my opinion, it gives us freedom, not the ultimate freedom that all nations desire and develop to, but the freedom to achieve it.
The Dáil, now meeting in Earlsfort Terrace, began a long series of fiery treaty debates. After one session, Collins wrote to Kitty Kiernan,
"This is the worst day I've had yet. Far, far the worst. May God help us all."
But increasing numbers put their support behind Collins and Griffith. At last, on the 7th of January 1922, the Dáil approved the action of the Irish delegates in signing the treaty. The voting was 64 votes to 57. A provisional government was elected with Collins as chairman. De Valera resigned his presidency. Arthur Griffith was elected to the office. The evacuation by British forces began almost immediately. Significantly, the first fortifications to be dismantled were those outside Dublin Castle. The auxiliaries and the Black and Tans were demobbed and left quickly, seemingly as pleased to be leaving as the Irish were to see them go. The departure of the vast British military machine during the following months was, to most people, the outward sign that Ireland had achieved, after 7 centuries, at least some semblance of independence. Only a small force of troops would remain to see the transfer of power. To Michael Collins, however, the real sign was the evacuation of Dublin Castle by the civilian administration, which he had partly crippled in the Custom House fire, and the remains of its intelligence network blinded by him on Bloody Sunday. On the day of the takeover of Dublin Castle, Collins arrived some minutes late.
And he marched up to the British commanding officer, and Dalton's feelings fell when the officer said to him, "You're 7.5 minutes late, General Collins." Dalton thought Michael might pay a rather uncomplimentary reply, and Collins stepped up to him, put his hand on his shoulder and said, "After 7.5 centuries, you're welcome to the 7.5 minutes.
At the end of January, even as new uniforms were being hurriedly issued, Collins stood on the steps of City Hall alongside Dublin Castle as the first unit of the newly created Free State Army marched past to take over Beggar's Bush Barracks, former headquarters of the Black and Tans. But while this show of the new administration captured the headlines, there were rumblings and IRA activity in different parts of the country. In some areas, both the IRA and Free State Army almost jostled each other to take over from the British. To allow the people to vote on the treaty and to avoid a split in the Sinn Féin party, Collins and De Valera agreed to a political truce, a pact which enabled a constitution to be drawn up and submitted to the electorate along with the treaty in a general election. It was during these traumatic months that Michael Collins and Kitty Kiernan became officially engaged to be married. Irish and British reporters and photographers descended on Kitty's home in County Longford. Harry Boland, who had hoped to marry Kitty, wrote,
"Kitty, I want to congratulate you. Michael told me of your engagement, and I wish you long life and happiness."
Simmering Republican discontent reached boiling point on the 14th of April when a group of anti-treaty IRA men, or irregulars as they were called, seized the seat of legal administration in Dublin, the Four Courts, and other buildings in the city centre. Collins made no move to dislodge them. In June, the results of the general elections were announced. Those against the treaty secured only 36 of the 125 seats. Collins now had a clear mandate, and he was reminded of this in a letter from Lloyd George, who demanded that the IRA be removed from the Four Courts.
Various suggestions were made at a staff meeting about what way to go about it best. It was suggested that they be starved from water supply cut off, and food supplies cut off. And I'm afraid I personally objected to that. I was by way of being director of operations, amongst other problems, and I advocated shelling it. I mounted a gun at the points where I thought they'd be most advantageous. Then I tried to instruct a team of 4 on how to load this gun. I had completely overlooked the fact that you've got to put the tail of the gun under something to stop the repercussion. The first thing that happened was that the gun jumped back and knocked the 3 of us out, practically. But the shell landed anyhow at the Four Courts. The British had deceived me. They were told to give me high-velocity shells, and instead of that they'd given me shrapnel, which was like hitting the place with pea shooters.
But after 2 days of siege and the firing of almost 400 shells, the IRA surrendered. The Free State Army then concentrated on the other IRA strongholds in Dublin. IRA snipers had to be dislodged with machine guns and incendiary bombs from business premises, hotels, and even the tops of monuments. For 5 days the battles raged. Once again, the centre of the capital was laid waste. These weren't the first shots in the Civil War, but they did herald the outbreak of general warfare between pro- and anti-treaty sides throughout the country. Among the casualties of the Dublin fighting was Collins's one-time colleague, but latterly opponent, Cathal Brugha, who had refused to surrender. Eamon de Valera escaped. A war council was formed by the provisional government. Michael Collins was appointed commander-in-chief of the army with the rank of general. He resigned his cabinet position to devote himself to the war against former friends and comrades, the IRA. From this office in Portobello Barracks, ironically in later years renamed Cathal Brugha Barracks, he conducted his campaign. As he received daily casualty reports and the names in them of those who had once fought alongside him against a common enemy and for a common cause, his sense of grief mounted.
He was completely kind of heavy-hearted at that time at the fact that brother was fighting against brother, and so many families we knew, like people who came to our house previously, they all shunned one another then, which was really a terrible tragedy.
The IRA had now concentrated its efforts on cities and towns outside Dublin. Again, the new army moved against them, forcing them out into the countryside. But in the south, the city and most of the county of Cork and its westerly neighbour Kerry stubbornly held out, their access roads and rail links mined or blocked. In a masterly operation, Major General Dalton moved a huge force by sea from Dublin and sailed up the River Lee to capture Cork City by outflanking a defence set mainly against attack by land. It was a repetition of operations carried out in other areas in previous weeks. But the celebrations were short-lived. On the following day, President Griffith, exhausted and broken-hearted, suffered a massive stroke. Collins helped carry the coffin of his old friend from the Pro Cathedral in Dublin. 300,000 people lined the funeral route to Glasnevin Cemetery. Dublin was in mourning for a man who had struggled all his life to wrench Ireland free from foreign rule, and yet lived only long enough to see his best efforts turn his fellow countrymen upon each other. Michael Collins would survive Arthur Griffith by only 10 days. On Saturday the 19th of August, Collins went to Greystones to have his confession heard. Did he perhaps have a premonition of death? At 6 o'clock the following morning, Collins left Portobello Barracks in a small convoy, officially for an inspection tour of the south. He was, in fact, making a desperate and secretive effort to stop the Civil War. Collins had already made contact through mutual friends with neutral officers, those who hadn't taken either side in the current war. Through these officers, Collins would discuss peace with the leaders of the IRA side. Some of those leaders had already been captured and were being held in Portlaoise prison, then called Maryborough Jail, in the South Midlands. Collins spent an hour talking to them, but obviously unsuccessful, left in a vexed mood for Limerick. Suffering from a heavy cold and a kidney infection, Collins had to stop frequently on the journey. The strain of his illness and his mental burden can be seen in this snapshot taken at the time. He was edgy too. Watching his men remove a bridge obstruction near Kilmallock, he didn't notice the approach of the amateur photographer who took this picture. The click of the shutter made Collins snatch for his revolver. After inspecting the Free State garrison at Newcastle West, he travelled southeastwards to Mallow in County Cork for more talks, and then that evening to the Imperial Hotel in Cork City, where Emmett Dalton had set up his headquarters.
I was concerned to see him there because I knew how boyish he was. I mean, how I knew the warmth and the extent of his heart. And he had so many connections and associations with Cork, and West Cork particularly. He had a devout love for his people. They didn't understand him. And he felt that I told him he was taking an unnecessary risk when they sort of, he said, surely, they won't shoot me in my own county. Jocosely, you know the sequel.
On the following day, Collins travelled some 30 miles with Dalton to Macroom, where he had secret talks with an influential neutral IRA officer. That afternoon, he made the last entry in his personal diary.
The people here want no compromise with the irregulars. It would be a big thing to get civic guards both here and in Limerick. Civil administration urgent everywhere in the south. The people are splendid.
Everywhere Collins went, he was surrounded by well-wishers. But, like Emmett Dalton, Kitty Kiernan at home in Longford was concerned about his safety. In his final letter to Kitty, he wrote,
Kitty, you won't be cross with me for the way I go around. I can't help it, and if I were to do anything else, it wouldn't be me, and I really couldn't stand it. And somehow I feel the way I go on is better. And please, please don't worry.
One of those who dined with Collins in Cork City was his nephew, Sean, then a quartermaster sergeant in the Free State Army.
There were two soldiers supposed to be on sentry duty in the foyer of the Imperial Hotel, and they were leaning up against one another, half asleep or something like that. But he came, banged their heads together and walked straight in, which I rather enjoyed. So, I mean, it was his gesture of saying he knew what went on, and he just bumped them together, cut out the nonsense, and got on with the business. So he went into a small dining room in the Imperial Hotel where he met my mother, and we had tea together at a table in the hotel. Now, he told us at that stage what he was going to do, because he was really going to go home to Sam's Cross to see the people there. He was always interested in that. And I rather stupidly and foolishly said, could I go with him? And you can imagine what he said to me. At least I got a firm no. Mind my own business and do what I was being employed on.
What was his mood like at that meeting?
Very jovial, a bit tired, a bad cold. Of course, being with the ladies, my mother was more concerned about the state of his health than he was in what he was going to do in Sam's Cross. But he had a very severe cold, bordering on pleurisy, but she knew that before he ever started. For a very humane reason, she didn't want him to travel to Cork at all at this stage, because he wasn't well enough, really. But however, he went down and did it. So that I would describe him at that time as in reasonably good form. He was a very serious fellow, you know. He didn't waste time talking about himself. And he didn't have much time for discussion other than discussion on the family.
At 6:15 on the morning of Tuesday the 22nd of August, Collins, with Emmett Dalton, set off in a military convoy from the Imperial Hotel in Cork City. The convoy consisted of a motorcycle scout, Lieutenant John Joseph Smith, nicknamed Jersey Smith, from Enniscorthy in County Wexford, a British Army veteran, later the IRA, and now the Free State Army. Behind him, a tender carrying 8 riflemen, 2 Lewis machine gunners and 2 officers, including the man in charge of the convoy, Commandant Sean O'Connell, known as Paddy O'Connell from Dura, Ennis, County Clare. O'Connell was one of Collins's original 12 apostles. Collins and Dalton sat in the back of an open-topped yellow touring car, a Leyland Thomas, driven alternately by Privates Mick Corrie from Cheshire in England and Quinn, an Irishman, ex-IRA. Bringing up the rear of the convoy was Slieve na Mon, a Rolls-Royce Whippet armoured car. This carried 5, including machine gunner John McPeak, who manned the Vickers .303 gun in its revolving turret. McPeak, a native of Glasgow, was another British Army veteran who had joined the IRA and subsequently enlisted in the new Irish Army. It was certainly not an adequate escort for a commander-in-chief in territory teeming with guerrilla fighters. Again on this day, Collins travelled west to Macroom to speak to a neutral officer, Florrie Donoghue, then to Bandon via the tiny village of Bailnabla. Here at Bailnabla, they asked directions for Bandon. Unknown to Collins, senior brigade and divisional IRA officers from various parts of the county had been gathering in this farmhouse overlooking the village and in the local public house for a war council on this very day. The IRA officer in charge was Brigade Commander Tom Hales, greatly admired by Collins. During the Black and Tan times, Hales had been captured and tortured. He's photographed here at Bandon Barracks with a companion who is being forced to wave a Union Jack flag. This second man never recovered mentally from his ill treatment. When Hales learned of Collins's appearance at Bailnabla, he immediately set about laying an ambush in case the big fellow should return by the same route. A beer bottle collection cart was commandeered and placed across the road on the Bandon side of the village. In front of this, a 12-inch long mine containing 7 pounds of gelignite was buried beneath the surface of the road and connected to a detonating plunger on higher ground. 22 riflemen were then placed in ambush positions overlooking the road to await a possible return of the convoy. Also unknown to Collins, Eamon de Valera had stayed overnight in this house close to Bailnabla. Although opposed to Collins, he had also been trying to stop the carnage of the Civil War. But the Commander-in-Chief of the IRA, General Liam Lynch, was reluctant to end hostilities, and he instructed his officers not to encourage de Valera in his efforts. Just over half an hour after Collins had passed through, de Valera came to Bailnabla. Despite gossip and malicious rumour, there's no evidence that he was involved in the planning of the ambush then being laid for his former friend and colleague. Collins, meanwhile, reached Bandon. He then travelled to Clonakilty for lunch and onwards to Rosscarbery and his old homestead at Sam's Cross to meet members of his family. The convoy stopped at the local pub. Collins told a local officer that he was going to put an end to this bloody war. At Skibbereen, he had yet more talks at the Eldon Hotel. He's pictured leaving there at 5 o'clock that afternoon to return to Bandon for tea. One of the officers he met at Bandon was his great friend, John L. Sullivan.
I remember him saying to me clearly that I'm down to finish the Civil War.
What did he mean by that?
Now, that's a question I can't answer, but what I thought he meant was that he was meeting somebody from the other side probably to try and finish the fighting.
Collins also had detailed talks with the local Free State commander, Major General Sean Hales. 8 miles away, Hales's brother Tom, fighting on the other side, was meeting fellow IRA officers at Bailnabla. After tea in Lee's Hotel, now the Munster Arms, Collins, Dalton and the rest of the convoy set off for Cork via Bailnabla. This was the last photograph taken of Collins alive. Meanwhile, at Bailnabla, Tom Hales had sent most of his ambush party back to Long's public house, believing, because of the late hour, that Collins was not now going to return to Cork through the village. He helped a party of 6 or 7 men to disconnect the mine and clear away the roadblock. A lookout was posted in the laneway overlooking the road in case any Free State troops should appear. Collins's convoy, meantime, was heading towards them. This model shows the ambush area, the convoy road at the bottom of the picture, the stream above that, and at the top the laneway used by the IRA. The area from left to right is about half a mile. Some witnesses said the barricade was at the bridge on the right, others that it was 100 yards beyond it, towards Bailnablaw crossroads. As the convoy reached Bailnablaw, it was just after 7 o'clock local time, 15 minutes to sunset. A light drizzle had begun to fall, a mist was drifting across distant fields. Collins huddled into the collar of his greatcoat. The drivers noticed that he and Dalton had lifted their rifles from the floor, a premonition perhaps. The IRA lookout, startled by the convoy, fired warning shots for his companions. Emmett Dalton shouted, "Drive like hell," but Collins yelled, "No, stop and we'll fight him." They jumped from the car and took up firing positions. Lieutenant Smith, meantime, raced on down the road, followed by the Crossley tender. At the barricade, the men had heard the shooting and scrambled up to higher ground for cover, firing at the approaching motorbike. One shot hit the handlebars. Smith turned the machine and drove it into the ditch, then waved frantic warnings to the men in the Crossley tender to take cover. The troops jumped out, and dividing into 2 sections, the first section ran to the barricade to move it aside, the second section gave them covering fire. The IRA men ran up the laneway in a series of sprints under constant fire from the Lewis gun and rifles below. As the barricade was cleared aside, some of the Free State troops moved after the IRA men, pushing them along the laneway towards Collins and the rest of the convoy at the other end of the battle area. At that end, the armoured car had now reversed a short distance to get into a better firing position on the men running along the lane. The bullets cut the grass at their feet. Commandant O'Connell and Lieutenant Smith made their way back from the barricade position to inform Dalton and Collins that the obstruction had now been cleared. But just as the IRA men were pinned down, the Vickers machine gun jammed. Lieutenant Goff, helping McPeak, had made a mess of loading an ammunition belt. The unexpected respite allowed some of the IRA men to begin moving along the laneway again. Collins saw their movement and ran from the cover of the ditch to the back of the armoured car to fire on them. Collins's next move was foolhardy and fatal. He left the protection of the Slieve na Món and moved back down the road. He fired some shots, and then, as he was opening the bolt to reload, there were still occasional bursts of fire from the IRA positions. Concerned about Collins, Dalton and the other officers ran, crouching, around the corner to find him. He was lying face down. There was a large gaping hole in the back of his head behind the right ear. There was increased firing now from the IRA. A bullet went cleanly through the neck of Lieutenant Smith. Commandant O'Connell whispered an act of contrition into Collins's ear, but the big fellow was already dead. Darkness was falling. The IRA now made their escape across country. Collins was lifted into the back of the touring car, his head resting on Dalton's shoulder, to begin the sorrowful journey to Cork City. Those, then, are the facts of Michael Collins's death. Or are they? After the shooting of Michael Collins at Bale-na-Blah, the convoy made its way in darkness around obstacles of felled trees, trenches and blown bridges, and stopped at the railings outside this church. A priest was brought from the house across the road. He took one look at Collins and turned and walked away. In anger, one of the escort soldiers fired at the priest, but the rifle was thrown off target by Emmett Dalton.
Personally, I was holding the body of the Commander-in-Chief in my arms, and the rest of the cortege was moving ahead as best they could. And it was a sad, sad journey. When we arrived in the city of Cork, there was consternation at my headquarters. We had my doctor attached to my division was there, and he took charge of the body.
Collins's body was taken here to Shannakeil Hospital, a small privately owned establishment which held a contract with the British government to care for British soldiers. In an upstairs room, the body was washed and laid out. Emmett Dalton sent a telegraph to Army headquarters in Dublin reporting the death of the Commander-in-Chief. In Dublin, the Chief of Staff, Richard Mulcahy, sent a message to all troops to stand calmly at their posts and not engage in any kind of reprisals. The IRA Chief of Staff, Liam Lynch, sent a message of congratulations to his men involved in the fight at Bale-na-Blah, although he regretted the loss of such men as Collins because of the Civil War.
I remember when I got word of his death, I had taken over Dunmanway with Hales. And it was 2 days after he died, he was killed, that we got word that he was dead. And I'll never forget hearing it. It came down the street and people stopped. They never put it, once they heard it, they just stopped on their tracks and put their head down. Whether they were friends or supporters or enemies, meant nothing. Collins was dead, the man that couldn't be killed. And it hit everyone.
When news came through to IRA men held in Kilmainham jail in Dublin, 1,000 of them knelt in prayer for the man who had once led them. This unprompted demonstration of respect would be repeated in jails up and down the country, a country stunned into almost disbelief. Collins was taken by ship to Dublin and laid out first in the old St. Vincent's Hospital. Among those who visited the mortuary was Lady Hazel Lavery. When the body was taken to City Hall for the official lying in state, tens of thousands queued to pay their respects, including British soldiers who less than a year previously had searched the country for this man. The anguish of most of the nation is captured in this photograph of Collins's eldest brother, Sean. Commandant O'Connell, who held Collins's head and whispered the act of contrition at Bale-na-Blah, would never recover from the death of his friend. Even his house in Dublin would bear a constant reminder.
He was a very sort of shy and sensitive man, and I think the effect of it affected him for the rest of his life. It affected him so much, I think, that he didn't want to speak about those times. And any time we asked him things or approached the question about those times, he just avoided it, you know. He said it was too hurtful to talk about it. He was there, of course, and he was the man that said the act of contrition into his ear when he was dying on the road. And I think it was the only time in his life, I believe, that he ever cried. And he cried over that man because he loved him very, very much.
It was undoubtedly this feeling of loss, tinged perhaps with shame, that generated stories that his own men had conspired to murder Collins. fearful that reports of secret gun running by him to beleaguered Catholics in the north of Ireland meant a reopening of the war with Britain, that he was running with the hare and the hounds, that the carefully laid IRA ambush of earlier that day gave British-paid conspirators in the convoy an ideal opportunity to kill him.
All we really know about Béal-na-Bláth is, one, that Collins came into Béal-na-Bláth alive and left it dead. That's the first fact, that's all we know. There was some sort of a skirmish there, and the most important fact, I think, was that there was, after that skirmish in which Collins died, there was a massive cover-up. Now, one has to ask the question, why the cover-up? Why was there no proper autopsy? Why was there no inquest? Why was it never established what kind of a bullet he was shot by? Why was this massive cover-up? So we have three facts. One, he was killed there. Two, there was a skirmish. And three, there was a massive cover-up.
You've obviously formed an opinion. Why was there a cover-up?
Well, first of all, let me say, there is a prima facie case that he was shot by his own convoy, by his own men, accidentally. Within that prima facie case, there is a lesser case that he was murdered by one of his own men. I think when I say prima facie, all I mean is there is a case to be answered, and there is sufficient evidence for an inquiry as to whether he was shot by the IRA or whether he was shot by his own men.
Greatest suspicion fell on the Scot, 25-year-old John McPeak, the machine gunner in the armoured car. A few months after Béal-na-Bláth, he deserted to the IRA side, taking the Slieve-na-Mon car with him. He was smuggled back to his native Glasgow, but was extradited to Ireland and served 5 years of a 6-year sentence. Why did he desert? For the love of a woman, he said many years later, a woman in Cumann-na-Mon, the women's section of the IRA. Could McPeak have shot Collins with the Vickers machine gun? Yes, possibly. But why didn't any of those in the armoured car with him testify that he had swung the turret around to where Collins was standing 15 yards behind the vehicle? Likewise, none of the IRA men firing down on the convoy ever claimed the turret swiveled towards Collins, even though some of them saw him fall after he had been hit. What about Emmett Dalton, the ex-British Army officer? Could he have been a British plant to settle old scores for Dublin Castle? This suggestion down through the years has continued to blight Dalton's name. But the accusation that he killed Collins is ridiculous, for, according to Free State and IRA witnesses, Collins was around the corner of the road and out of Dalton's sight when he was shot. But it was Dalton himself who spoke a truth. Until recent years, it was believed that firing by the IRA came from nowhere but the laneway on the west side of the road.
At the time, I felt that there was a little fire coming from up there, that hill up there. Nobody seemed to have agreed with me, but I felt at the time there was.
In fact, there were 3 separate and unconnected groups of IRA men on that sloping hillside. The first was led by Mike Donoghue of Glenflesk, County Kerry. Men who, like many others, were making their way home after losing Cork City. Unaware of the ambush plan, but hearing the firing, they had raced over the hill to see the convoy halted and under fire. Another 2 IRA men, Bobs Doherty and a colleague, also making their way westward and equally unaware of the ambush, heard the shooting, and they too came quickly across country to take part. Incredibly, more IRA firepower was to be added. Up the road, on the Bandon end, where Michael Collins had been fighting, a group of IRA men moving eastwards towards their home in Waterford came upon the last stages of the fighting. At Long's public house, IRA Commander Liam Deasy and his men had heard the firing, and they too hurried to the gorge. More than 17 minutes had passed since the first shots by the IRA lookout. Collins had now been dead several minutes. The men from the pub fired a few random shots at the already departing convoy and then left the hillside. In this field, overlooking the barricade position, Ellen Allen, then a 19-year-old girl, was moving cows when the first shots were fired. Later that night, she'd learned that Collins had been killed on the road below.
Like, I mean, they were placed in 16 and for like tea for it, which was quite usual at that time. Like, you get no warning or anything. And the conversation went on, and someone, some other fella came to the door, and he said, the fellas that was waiting for the tea were gone, and he said, it didn't matter. And he said, oh yes, there's no where they gone. And he said, it didn't matter. And he said, he only came to tell them Micheal was bowled over.
And that's the way they put it?
That's the way they put it.
Did you go back to the ambush site then later on?
We did. We made the attempt to find that. We got too dark, and somebody told us to go back. But it wasn't a very nice sight. Blood and all of them, all his brains and all.
Did you go back the next day and look?
It was cleaned up then.
This is Emmett Dalton's cap, used by him to contain the huge wound in the back of Collins's head on the journey to Cork City.
It was all quite obviously to me, with the experience I had, it was a ricochet bullet. It could only have been a ricochet or a dum-dum.
It was believed, and my father firmly believed, and who was very used to war wounds from France, 1916, 1914. He was very certain that he was hit by a ricochet bullet, a bullet that either ricocheted off some metal part of the car or something on the road, some stone or something on the road. The bullet ricocheted and it hit him there, above and behind his right ear.
According to a local historian, Collins was hit by a round-nosed bullet which had ricocheted off the turret of the armoured car, a shot fired from the sloping hill to Collins's right.
I have investigated the Slave of the Mon, and I know the position of Mike Donohoe's men, the position of the Slave of the Mon, and where Collins fell. It's in one straight line. I have an engineer's chart drawn of this. Exactly right. I know how the victors was pointed at the time of the ambush when it was firing, and the angles are correct. So flattened off the top of the armored car, this would create a disc of anything circumference of almost 3 inches and would effectively reduce that wound.
A bullet that ricochets can become badly distorted after making contact with the intermediate object. This causes an uglier wound than normal. But could this be 2 to 3 inches in diameter?
Ricochet entry can only be as large as the bullet itself can distort. And well, it's talking perhaps of 3/4 of an inch in diameter, but not 2 or 3 inches. If, on the other hand, a bullet broke up quite close to the head, then you could have several pieces of one bullet a distance apart, causing that entry. But I think that's a difficult scenario to envisage. I mean, you're talking about the head being a matter of a few inches only from the surface from which that bullet would ricochet.
It has also been alleged that a dum-dum bullet was fired by one of the IRA men. This is a bullet which has had a cross cut into its nose or opened up to create greater wounding power by spreading when it strikes a target.
Yeah, I myself hear this term dum-dum bullet used, and I'm not very convinced about it. It hasn't cropped up in my own practice, whereas in general lead bullets, and most bullets are lead, they may have a coating of something a bit harder like a copper or nickel jacket. These may enter in a distorted state. I recall one, but that was a high-velocity one, which entered as a ricochet some years ago. And this created quite a large hole in a man's head, large, 3/4 of an inch to 1 inch in diameter.
So we're not talking fist or gaping hole in the back of the head?
No.
There was this one wound, there was no entrance wound other than this.
Just a great gaping
hole, yes.
But Canon Sean Piggott, the army chaplain who received the body in Dublin, confirmed to me that there were 2 wounds in Collins's head, front and rear. And 5 other people, including Dr. Oliver St. John Gogarty, who embalmed the body, have also testified to those 2 wounds.
Gogarty and all the others saw the entry wound. They saw the exit wound, which was enormous, and the blood was flowing out of it and the brains were out of it. It took Gogarty, when Gogarty was preparing him to lay out his body, it took 3 or 4 pounds of wax of some substance to put in here in order to close that up. before he was laid out for to lie in state. So it was an enormous piece torn out.
It has been consistently said that there was a gaping wound at the back of the head. Some witnesses said that practically the whole back of the head had been blown off. What would that suggest to you?
That would immediately suggest an exit wound from a high-velocity projectile. By high velocity, I mean a rifle or machine gun bullet.
The Mauser pistol was one of the weapons in use at Bale-na-Bláth and later claimed to have killed Collins. But this was a low-velocity weapon. The weapon that killed him, consistent with the evidence, was a Lee Enfield .303 and used by the man I believe shot Collins. A skull is made up of 3 layers, outer and inner tables of bone, and between those layers the diploe, a latticework of bone and blood vessels. When a high-velocity bullet penetrates a skull, it takes away a section of all 3 layers. Usually the displaced bone breaks up into smaller fragments, which, pushed onwards and away by the bullet, now become missiles in themselves, damaging the brain tissue in their paths. The bullet itself carries before it a cushion of air forced into the skull at the entry wound. This pushes the bone fragments further into the brain. If the bullet strikes hard bone inside the head, such as that behind the ear, it expends its energy on smashing that bone and carrying the fragments onwards. These, together with the cushion of air, cause what is called an explosive exit wound, very much larger and uglier than the entry wound.
If you recall your physics, the force of any moving object, like a bullet, is mass times the velocity squared. In other words, it's the square of the velocity. Velocity is a much bigger effect on the net force than the actual weight of the bullet. Hence the importance of a high-velocity bullet, which may be traveling on the order of 3,000 feet per second, as against a revolver or handgun bullet, which is traveling at a speed of the order of 700 feet per second, or at most with, say, a long-muzzled Mauser or Luger pistol, which might achieve 1,200 feet per second.
According to IRA men who saw him fall, Collins was facing the laneway when he was shot, with an entry wound at the front of his head and an explosive exit wound at the rear, as testified by 6 witnesses. Then it's obvious that he was shot from the laneway. After all these years of silence, Jim Carney, who claims to be the last surviving member of the original IRA party at Bale-na-Bláth, has agreed to speak.
We were there for 3 days because it was a meeting of the 1st Southern Division officers of the IRA in the hope of speeding up the war or ending it, you know, because it was hopeless the way it was going. And Collins happened to come through in the morning with his party, you see. So they decided that they'd lay an ambush for him going back. So we took up positions, we laid a mine. I was one of the men knowing about that mine.
How many others were involved that day on your side?
You mean in the real fight?
Yes.
4. 3 of us and the men that fired the fatal shot.
Only 4 men?
Only 4. There was 5 there now. The scout was still at the back, but he took no part in, because he stayed where he was.
And you know who fired the fatal shot?
I know who fired the fatal shot. I was talking to him and he was sorry because it was a dumb bullet, you know. It don't penetrate, but it kind of explode when it hit anything hard, you know. That's how that gaping wound came in the cap and the head.
In the interests of historical fact, and establishing fact for once and for all, will you give us the name of the man who fired the shot?
Not for any money.
However, off camera, Jim Carney eventually conceded that I had pinpointed the man who shot Collins. On camera, he did say this.
It was fired by an IRA man, not McPeak nor any other than the Free State Army.
And I have now learned that within a couple of days of Collins's death, the intelligence staff of IRA headquarters got a detailed and personal report from the man who said he pulled the trigger. He was 32-year-old Dennis O'Neill, an ex-British Army marksman from Maryborough, Timoleague, County Cork, who had joined the IRA. Nicknamed Sonny O'Neill, it was he who provided covering fire for his retreating colleagues at Bailnablaw. According to this letter, he came to Dublin and gave a graphic description of his shooting of Collins to the IRA's then Chief Intelligence Officer, Commandant General Sean Dowling, at a house in Adelaide Road. The letter was written 10 months before her death by Moira Comerford, who was an IRA headquarters courier and driver at that time. Sonny O'Neill's name has also been confirmed to me by a surviving IRA intelligence officer, Eamon de Barra, although he understands Collins was lying on the ground when he was shot and was hit by a ricochet bullet.
Sonny O'Neill had seen service in the British Army, and he was a crack shot. Well, they were there on the brow of the hill when Tom Hale said, "I'll go down and shift that cart, lads." I was laid down for the ambush planned in the morning, because the farmers going to the creamery in the morning will curse us if the impediments are there. Tom Hales went down, and he was only just down on the place where the cart was when the motorcyclist who was ahead of the Collins party came around the corner, and Tommy Keller shouted down to Tom Hales to clear out, and they opened fire in order to cover his retreat. And the fire went on for some time, and then, according to Tommy Keller, they decided to go and join the main body. But O'Neill said, "I'll have one last shot at that fellow." And it was pointing to the place where Michael Collins was lying down. They could see him indistinctly in the fading light. He didn't intend to hit him, according to Tom Keller. But the road there, it wasn't Tar Macadam at that time, it was a milestone road. And he fired near where Michael Collins was lying, and the bullet ricocheted off a lump of limestone and got Mick in the back of the head. That's God rest him.
But would a marksman such as Sonny O'Neill risk one final shot at Michael Collins in order to deliberately miss the target? Collins was the commander-in-chief of the opposing forces. His killing was simply an act of war. The purpose of the original ambush plan was to carry out that very task.
The ambush was set there for him, and whether it was a bullet by accident or not, the ambush was set and they intended to kill him.
There was no doubt at the time in the minds of the IRA's senior officers about who shot Michael Collins, although for obvious reasons they remained tight-lipped about Sonny O'Neill's report. That silence, understandable though it was, has until now been the cause of denial and counter-accusation. For example, the man who told Eamon de Barra about Sonny O'Neill's involvement had, a few years earlier, said this in a television interview.
The remarkable thing was that you had 4 British officers guardian. Well, it was remarkable on Michael Collins' side to have a British officer guardian. You know, it is very hard to believe that. It is hard to understand that from my point of view. Why should he have 4 officers guardian? And I believe one of the 4 said, "We'll get him before we come back." And they got him. They got one of the 4 shot him, I believe. Because the IRA did not shoot him, did not definitely shoot him.
Well,
there was a couple of shots fired, but...
Well, how do you know that, Tom?
Huh?
How do you know the IRA did not shoot him?
Sure, I was there.
But, as we've already heard, this man was later to admit to Sonny O'Neill shooting Collins. However, the evidence to corroborate O'Neill's confession, the entry and exit wounds, will only be accepted fully if and only if the embalmed body of Michael Collins is exhumed and forensically examined.
We would then find out whether that bullet was fired from 10 yards, 15 yards or 100 yards. And if it was fired for 100 yards or so, then the IRA shot him. If it was fired from closer, then he was shot by one of his own.
Exhumation is the only way to solve the matter of the two bullet wounds. And then we know how Michael Collins was killed at Bernablaw.
The man is dead, the time has gone past, and he, like all the others, are resting in peace now, please God. And I wouldn't, under any circumstances, agree to.
Well, I'm only speaking for myself, but I certainly wouldn't approve of it. You see, this business of how he died is quite irrelevant to my way of thinking.
If it could solve any problem of identity with regard to things, or if it could solve any medical problem, I would certainly have no objection to it. But I couldn't frankly see what could be gained by it.
What could be gained but playing to the dramatic and rekindling old wounds by exhuming the body of a man who was laid to rest in August 22 and should remain undisturbed in that rest.
Only one floral tribute was permitted on Michael Collins's coffin, a single white peace lily. It was from Kitty Kiernan.
My very own Micheal, I was terrified that you would take all kinds of risks, and how I wished to be near you so that I could put my arms tightly round your neck and that nothing could happen to you. I wouldn't be a bit afraid when I'd be beside you. And if you were killed, I'd be dying with you, and that would be great, and far better than if I were left alone behind. I'd be very much alone if you were gone. Nothing could change that. And all last week in this, I've realized it, and that's what makes it so hard.
Michael Collins, soldier, guerrilla fighter, politician, diplomat, economist. Hard and cruel, yet capable of the tenderest love. A man who admired not only the tenacity of comrades, but the bravery of enemies. A man who cast a shadow, but was aware of another.
What have I got for Ireland? Something she has wanted these past 700 years. Will anyone be satisfied at the bargain? Will anyone? I tell you this, I signed my death warrant. I thought at the time, how odd, how ridiculous. A bullet may just as well have done the job 5 years ago. These signatures are the first real step for Ireland. If people will only remember that, the first real step.
Sonny O'Neill died in 1950. He was 60 years old. After prison release, John McPeake, the armoured car machine gunner, returned to Glasgow. In 1932, under an assumed name, he moved to London and married a Scottish girl of Irish descent. Liam Lynch, IRA Commander-in-Chief, was wounded on a mountainside in South Tipperary on April the 10th, 1923. He died that night in hospital. His successor ordered a general ceasefire the following month. 2 months after Collins's death, British Prime Minister David Lloyd George was defeated. The Irish Treaty was one of the main causes. He never again occupied a ministerial post. Eamon de Valera subsequently formed his own political party, Fianna Fáil, and remained in politics until 1959. He served 2 terms as President of Ireland and retired in 1973. He died in 1975, aged 92. Harry Boland was captured by Free State troops on July 31st, 1922, and trying to escape, was mortally wounded. Kitty Kiernan died in July 1945, probably from a kidney disorder. Her understanding husband had her buried as close as was possible to the grave of her beloved Micheal Collins, the grave still in the shadow of Béal na Blá.